Welcome to the High Note Podcast. I am Ted Zimnicki, founder of High Note Performance and HNPacademy.com, where we bring the tools perfected by sports science and neurology to high achievers in every field to turn them into the kind of humans that can't help but be successful. Joining us today, we have an incredible force in the opera and classical music space. He has a proven track record in arts management, in teaching, in coaching, and in reaching brand new audiences. You can see his students all around the world at major opera houses on every continent, in every language, and including some of the finest young artist programs around the world. We have with us today the one and only Don Marrazzo. Don, thank you so much for making some time.
Thank you so much for having me, Ted. I appreciate it.
So for anyone who may not have heard of you by some crazy account, I would love for you to introduce yourself. Who are you and what do you do?
So I'm Don Marrazzo, and I just started a new position here at the State University of New York, SUNY Fredonia School of Music, where I'm the Director of Opera Studies, Hillman Opera Producer, and Assistant Professor of Voice. So the SUNY Fredonia has had a long, rather remarkable history of opera production and success with the opera program. Hillman Opera is the opera component of the training curriculum here, and my predecessor in this role, Julie Newell, was doing this job for 27 years, and she's also a Fredonia alum, and she's still here teaching at the school, and she's remarkable. So I have the good fortune of stepping into this job last September and still having the opportunity, even though we are growing the program, to work with her and to assess and evaluate and appreciate so much of the incredible work that she did to get the program where it is now, and to help us go forward into the future of this the program and of opera studies at Fredonia. So.
That's awesome. So you've only been at Fredonia for about a year now. You've had 2 semesters under your belt. And up until that, you were almost exclusively in the more private sector of opera. Is that correct?
Well, I trained to be an opera singer. I was not from a musical background, but I stumbled kind of fortuitously at the end of my high school studies into the world of classical voice and opera. And I studied at the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. I did my bachelor's degree there and then had 3 years abroad in Amsterdam to study there. And realized pretty early on that I actually didn't want to be a performer. Interestingly enough, the more I kind of studied, I was like, that lifestyle really was not a lifestyle that appealed to me, but I became very fascinated with the voice science and pedagogy aspect of singing. And so I started teaching voice in my mid to late 20s. And, we as voice teachers are really a kind of composition or a composite of all of the voice teachers that we had, as well. And what I remember from my own voice studies was that I had teachers who were very focused on the vocal technique component, which is invaluable and which you have to give a tremendous amount of time and focus and attention to. But they weren't so focused on, or knowledgeable about, I should say, about what then happens once you've put your technique together. How do you build a career? How do you sustain a career? How do you create new inroads in the industry? How do you create new initiatives? All of these other things that were very interesting to me. And so, when I decided to be a voice teacher, I started, like I said, mid to late 20s. I really I set out to be a kind of voice teacher that I almost wish that I had, which was a voice teacher who was very skilled in technique, but also could talk about repertoire and auditioning and working with artist managers. And so while I was teaching and developing my teaching, I started working in arts administration. And so I worked in PR and marketing for elite level opera singers in New York City for 4 years. I was doing that. And then I went to Glimmerglass Opera in upstate New York in Cooperstown and started as the head of publicity there, and then transitioned into the artistic department, where I was the director of artistic operations, casting and artistic operations. So I did all the casting. I ran the young artist program. After that, I went into artist management at Astral Artists, and that was very important to me because I wanted to learn more about artist management and contract negotiation in that way. And And then finally went back to school. I won a fellowship, a full scholarship and salary to Penn State University, where I got a double master's in voice pedagogy in musical theater and in classical voice. So, and then those degrees at Penn State, those opportunities really opened the doors for me to join a faculty at a university, because of course being on a faculty is also dependent on your degree status, right? The level of education you yourself has received. But yeah, I did a lot of, even though it's always been, I always wanted to be a voice teacher, I felt like there were a lot of, I would say, gaps to fill in, or things that I wanted to accomplish and experience also as an arts administrator, so that I could be the most, let's say I could give the singers that I work with the most comprehensive experience in the studio, that I could talk to them about, really work with them to develop their techniques to a very refined place. And then also say to them, okay, now this is the strategy for competitions, young artist programs, management. This is where you are repertoire-wise right now in this house. And then I did go abroad for 6 years. I was teaching in Amsterdam for 4 years and in Greece for 2 years. And that was also very strategic, because now that I'm back in the States, I feel much better equipped to talk about with American singers about what it means to build a career in Europe, what they're looking at in different countries, what the aesthetic is in terms of vocalism in different countries, in Belgium and the Netherlands and Switzerland and Italy and all of these different places. And so the goal through all of this, even though my resume to people might seem a bit of an unusual trajectory, it's all been very strategic to figure out how I can be the greatest resource to anybody that I work with, right?
That's incredible. There's so many. I feel like every sentence you just said, we could do a whole episode on each one of those individual sentences. But going back to the first piece of what you said, you realized very early on that the performing lifestyle wasn't for you. Right. How did you realize it, and how did you cope with that realization? It feels like so much of the way that voice teaching is set up, at least in my upbringing, was like, well, you go to school, you get your degree, and then you perform.
Right.
And what do you do after you perform? You die? I don't know.
Right.
Of course, that's not the case. But how did you come to that realization?
Well, I think that it's a great question. Thank you. So I didn't, like I said, I didn't come up with really a musical, I wasn't brought up with a musical upbringing, so to speak. My maternal grandfather was a very successful professional musician, but he passed away before I was born, so I didn't know him. And he played in the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra for many years, and he toured with, because a lot of classical musicians at that time also were crossover artists, and so they were also playing for more contemporary singers like Barbra Streisand and Judy Garland and Johnny Mathis and all of these people. And that's when those singers actually had real orchestras on stage with them, right? And they used to bring, and so he did a lot of that. And he was really a very accomplished musician, but I wasn't raised knowing him. My parents were extremely supportive of whatever we wanted to do, me and my brother and sister and I, but they didn't have that background at all. And so I was very interested in a number of things growing up, and specifically I was really interested in like marine life, marine biology. There were a lot of things that I was very fascinated by with that, and so I wondered if that might be a path that I would take at a certain point. But I did grow up kind of, middle school, later high school, singing a bit, and when I got into high school and started singing in choir there, I had a choir director who also was very encouraging of me going into singing, to study singing at a conservatory level. I didn't really apply to many schools. The Curtis Institute of Music, where I ended up going, I really applied there because it was fairly close to home. I'm from the Philadelphia area, and for those of you who might not know the Curtis Institute of Music, it is a pretty remarkable institution. It was founded in 1924, and it's a full scholarship institution. They have a very small enrollment, and anybody who's admitted goes on a full scholarship. And in that way, they are not dependent on taking people who might not be super talented, but who can foot the tuition bill, right? This is really a very elite kind of conservatory.
It has produced some of the most incredible musicians that we've seen. Like it has. Just to make sure we're not underselling it here, Curtis is a big deal.
Yeah, it's I didn't know that it was a big. That's probably why I got in, because I couldn't even really read music when I went to Curtis. It was kind of a fluke thing that I got in there. I think if I had known it was a big deal, I wouldn't have probably gotten in. I would have freaked myself out. But ignorance is pretty bliss, and so yeah, I auditioned there and I got a call back and I auditioned, I got a call back, and a couple months later I got the letter of acceptance. So yes, it is a wonderful institution. Those of you who may have seen the movie Maestro that just came out with Bradley Cooper, it's all about Leonard Bernstein, and Leonard Bernstein is a graduate of Curtis, and really major artists have come out of there. Where I think, to get back to your question, when you say, how did I know that I didn't want to do that? I was suddenly surrounded by people who had a pedigree and had been kind of grooming themselves and had people grooming them to go to an institution like Curtis. And so there was a very specific mindset, I would say, amongst the students at Curtis, where it was hyper-focused, music 24/7. It was not a university setting at all. It was really conservatory. And they did have a reciprocal agreement with the University of Pennsylvania, where when you had time in your schedule, you could go take classes there, and there was just never time in the schedule. That was really, so it was not something I could have taken advantage of. But
how would you quantify the difference between university and conservatory?
Well, especially at Curtis, I mean, and I haven't been, I graduated from Curtis in 1997, so it's been a number of years, and I know the institution has grown and changed a lot also in terms of its visibility. When I went there, it was kind of this like best kept secret at 1724 Locust Street. It was like nobody really it was known amongst the people in the industry, but nobody in the public really knew about it. They all knew Juilliard. But Curtis has much greater visibility now, and they have a really strong marketing team and all of this. How I would quantify the difference is that, in a university setting, a university with a great music program, you still have access to, like, you are required to take, as a student, a fundamental core curriculum. So even if you are, if you're a music education major at Fredonia, you have to take math classes. You have to take all of these other classes that university students take, which help you become a well-rounded individual, I think, in many ways. It kind of creates a broader view of the world, when you're taking science or you're interacting with people in other majors, and you can, when you're at a conservatory, you do not have to take those classes. You do not. It is music. You are surrounded by people who are hyper-focused on making music. And not even, the thing at Curtis was, and I don't want to sound like I begrudge Curtis at all, because it opened many doors for me, but it wasn't at that time, and it may be very different now, but at that time it was not about, you can also lead a fascinating life in music as a music administrator or a music educator or a music. Your worth was defined as a performer, and it takes a very specific kind of person to succeed as a performer and to want to be a performer and to endure the incredible amount of pressure that exists as a performer, especially if you're going to have a career at the level that most Curtis people arrived at, whether it was, even if it was orchestral and not soloistic, they were in the best orchestras, or they were the best soloists, or, I was there with singers like Juan Diego Flores and Eric Owens and John Relier, and people who went on to major careers. And I remember being at Curtis and looking around and kind of looking at their focus and their drive, and already their level of technical proficiency. They sang very well at a very young age, and I didn't study very seriously. I didn't have voice teachers really leading up to this, so it's a wonder that I got in. But I remember looking around and thinking, well, one of these things is not like the others, and that one thing is me. I am not of this same construct. You have to also be extraordinarily you have to have a competitive sense about you, I think, in a way, to really arrive to where you want to be. If you want to be an elite level performer, it doesn't mean you can't be a nice person, but the level of ambition and focus and tunnel vision you have to do that in that way is very specific. And I have that in my teaching and in my arts administration. I remember being at Curtis and being more fascinated with other people singing than my own. And I was like, well, that's a sign that this is not probably going to go in the performer way, because you have to be, as a performer, really most obsessed with yourself, with getting yourself to where you have to go and what you have to do. So it was pretty obvious to me. And I had a lot of people there who were very supportive of my singing, and they were very encouraging, but I just remember thinking, this is not where I'm going to live the most fulfilling life, And it's interesting
amount of introspection that you had when you were so young.
I think so. Yeah, I think actually, I think that's also family upbringing. I come from a very rooted, grounded, practical family life. My parents were school teachers, but also business owners, and very thoughtful and strategic as people, and very, very bright. I have a very practical family. They're wonderful people. So I think that was kind of in me already from a young age of like, well, what is this, and do I feel happy in this, and so yeah, that was very clear to me. I think that if I had to do it again, it's all, how does it? Hindsight is always 2020. I think I probably would have flourished more in a university with a great music program, and where I could have kind of looked at other interests and felt that I was developing more fully as a person while I was making music. The thing to remember about music is that as a performer, you have to have something to perform about. You have to have something to sing about. You have to have something to play about. And so your development as a person, your internal life, your imagination, your passion, your creativity, all of these things, your relationships with people, romantic or friends or family, or whatever, all of these things feed into your being, which give you a soul to perform with. And so if you're not feeding those other areas of yourself, and becoming a really fully developed person, you tend to not be the most interesting artist. That's really a thing. And I think if I look back at the conservatory setting for myself, there were parts of me that wanted stimulation and wanted to be fulfilled that just weren't in that kind of hyper-focused environment. So, yeah.
So the choice to expand those horizons from like just being a singular performer, where I mean, so many professional opera singers have careers based on less than 5 roles potentially, where they just sing the same things over and over and over again. It was because you felt like you wanted to become more of a well-rounded person and see more of the world, experience more of what the world had to offer.
Totally. And I also felt like you have to find for yourself where you feel most authentic, where you feel most like yourself, and I tend to not be a person who needs a lot of external validation. I'm not a person who needs to be center stage. I knew that I wanted to be close to the art and be a person who could contribute to the field and be part of the process. But it didn't mean that I had to be the person to go out and do that on the stage. And so as a voice teacher, and I would say all of the roles that I've been in, whether it's a casting director or working in management or any of these things, they all feed me in different ways. But as a teacher, the most fulfilling role for me out of all the things I've done is a voice teacher, because you get to be part of the process of creation, but without the pressure of having to go out on stage and nail it in front of several thousand people, so it's actually very rewarding, but without the pressure. I also think that when you're helping someone find their voice, it's a very vulnerable thing in a way, and it's a very revealing thing. And I think you find, when you're finding your own technical coordination as a singer, you also find out a lot about yourself, right? Because your voice is an internal thing. It's not something you can easily see or touch, and it's a lot of kinesthesiology and awareness, and being really, really aware of your voice, your inner workings as a person. So I think you find out a lot about yourself as an individual by learning how to sing. And that's always also a very exciting process to be part of. I'm very clear as a voice teacher that I'm not a psychologist. I don't pretend to be, and I'm non-invasive. I don't expect or really want even people to feel that they have to share anything personal with me, but it is fascinating as the voice coordinates, or you see somebody developing, that their person develops. And that's a very rewarding thing to be part of. So, I think that was a very clear choice to be like, where do I feel like my most authentic self? And what is the thing that gets me up in the morning, and it's just like, I can't wait to do that. And for performers, I think that's performing. I think even if they are nervous, I mean, every great performer gets nervous. That's how it is. But for them, the benefit of doing it the result of doing it outweighs the nervousness. They really kind of, right, that's the thing that fuels them or jazzes them the most. For me, it's the teaching. It's doing thing where I'm like, I can't wait. And I can go 6, 7, 8 hours a day in teaching and feel totally inspired by the end of the day. So
that's awesome. I love that you mentioned the growth and the stepping into being a real person. It's something that we talk about here all the time, is the neurology behind the mind-body-voice connection, and how that, I mean, the research behind that is only getting more interesting. I'm sure you're up to date on that too. It's so cool.
It's a huge thing, Ted. It really is. It's like, and even when you're, as a voice teacher, I did do a lot of research into that as well, because when you're trying to change a habit in somebody, a vocal habit that they may have acquired a less than desirable or less than efficient vocal habit, you can't really say don't do that. If they're doing something, you have to say, because there's a neurological component to that. Their body has created a neural pathway about, like, this is what I do on that note. And you can't just say don't do that. You have to over time replace what they're doing with another pathway, something that the body can familiarize itself with. And so it is a long process. This is also a fascinating thing about teaching singing, is we are in such an instant time where everything is quick and instant and everything, and it just is not that at all. This is a long process that takes time and introspection and a lot of quiet mind space to figure out these small kind of movements, these things. And so it is fascinating. It is absolutely fascinating to be part of that.
I think that's so refreshing, right? That we've chosen a space, whether it's music or whether it's athletics, whatever kind of athlete you want to be, right? Where the time just has to be spent.
That's it.
Right? You can't ask ChatGPT for how to sing better. It just doesn't work.
Simone Biles, right? I mean, you can't become an elite level anything without, I mean, what is it's like 10,000 hours or something to master something or whatever. I mean, it's kind of like, yeah, you can't, which is more than that, but you never really, especially in this, you never really master it. I mean, by virtue of whatever it is, anything that is live and living is not perfect. It's never perfect. So, if you look at an elite level athlete and they pull off something really great, you're going to say that was amazing, and they're probably going to say yes, but on that turn, that's because you become so hyper aware of all of these small things that most people can't see, the general public would never know. Right. I went to a singer that I've known for quite a number of years. She was a young artist at Glimmer Class when I was there, and I went to her Met debut a few years ago, and she was singing Pamina, the magic flute, and it was just extraordinary. And I went up to her right afterwards and I said, "You were just amazing," backstage. And she said, "The B flat on Tamino," and I was like, "No, nobody really," but it's like when you're doing that thing, you just it can make you squirrely if you can't find the game in it, the play in it. It is a game, it's kind of a fun game to play, and but it's extraordinary.
Yeah. So why, out of all of the different fields that you could have gone into, you clearly have a remarkable head on your shoulders and the ability for introspection and seeing yourself in the world and the world on a whole is at a really high level for you. Why did you choose opera instead of a different field?
I think, when I went to Penn State, it's a great question again. When I went to, do you mean another field like within the arts, another area of the arts, or just something else totally different?
Either or both.
Okay, so when I went to Penn State for these advanced degrees in voice pedagogy, I was doing one in classical and one in musical theater and contemporary styles, which is also fascinating to me. I mean, it's incredible, and I listen to everything. My playlist is like everything. I'm fascinated by every kind of vocalism, every kind of music. I mean, I'm into all of it. But for me, within the industry, if we talk about, why did I stay in opera specifically in the arts, I find it to be really the Olympics of vocal use, because contemporary singing and musical theater, contemporary styles, musical theater, it's also extraordinary and extraordinarily difficult in its own way. But there is the assist of external amplification. So there is always something, I mean, they have to create so many different sounds and textures and all of this, but there is the assist of that, which is very helpful. It's a big assistance. When you are a classical singer, an opera singer, there is no microphone. There's no amplification. So your physical structure, your anatomy, has to be, and your function has to be maximized so that you are your microphone. You know, when you think that these two little vocal folds and your pharynx and your head structure, all this, that alone, you can create a sound that can self-amplify over 100-piece orchestra in a 5,000-seat house without any amplification. That is a really remarkable thing. It is almost, it's like incredibly human, but also like superhuman. It is something that is, and I'm people are always surprised when I talk to them. I say, well, we don't use microphones in opera. They're like, what? If it's just lay people, they're like, what? Everybody, I'm like, no, it's without that. It is without. So I find that, you know, like maybe that's part of my science brain, the kind of, but I find that extraordinary. And I find that also especially in opera, certainly in other styles as well, but especially in opera, when that coordination is set into place, voices are just so distinctive. They are so incredibly distinctive and like thumbprints, really a fingerprint voice. You know, it's really that. And sometimes in other styles, more contemporary styles, it's a little bit harder to find a voice that is totally distinctive, where they sing and you're like, I immediately know that that's that voice, right? I immediately know. There's certainly people like, you know, you hear Adele, you know it's Adele, you know, that's right. I mean, it's kind of, but I do find in opera that it is that kind of the technical work on it releases and allows for a very distinctive sound in many ways. So,
You could.
yeah.
There was a time where you could confuse Britney Spears with Christina Aguilera. You
Exactly.
probably wouldn't confuse UC Björling with Franco Corelli. Like,
Probably not, right? Exactly. And it's like, you know, in fact, sometimes like if we heard Britney Spears without her affects, you would not know it was her. I mean, everybody, the minute you say imitate Britney Spears, they all go, ah, they do a frog. They all do, right? So that's not her voice, that's an affect, right? They do. And so you go for the affect for imitation, but just the voice itself, you would probably not know that it was her voice, maybe, you know? So, and that's like, again, that's we know Beyonce's voice, right? There's certainly Celine Dion, you know that voice, but it's not only her voice, it's her affect. When people say imitate Celine Dion, there are certain things they do that immediately take on that quality. And that is different. You're right. Between UC Björling and Franco Corelli, that is totally different. So in terms of other things, like, you know, getting back to your question about other fields, again, this is kind of where I found my passion. It's really what excites me very much. I think that there are definitely other things that were of interest to me, like I said, marine biology, these things. I do think that healthcare is also very interesting for me because I think by nature I tend to be like a caregiving personality. I think that's something that, and so I do like to help people. That's part of you.
Teacher, you kind of have to.
You have to, exactly. Although there are a lot of people where you're like, why are you teaching? You know, kind of it's a little bit about self and all that. But no, I
won't ask for names. Don't worry.
No, and I would never anyway. You know, it's like, but I think, you know, teaching is such an act of service. It really is. And so I think that by nature, if you are a person of service and you are interested, and that makes you happy, that looking at any other industry that is kind of a service industry, especially as something as precious as healthcare or anything like that could be a fit as well. You know, those kind of industries.
So getting a little more philosophical for a second here, I think this is a really interesting question. I would love your take on it.
Sure.
Obviously, in the last 10 or 15 years or so, from a commercial perspective, opera has been going downhill, right? Mm-hmm. Like opera houses are closing, at least in the States. I'm really not at all familiar with what's going on in Europe or Asia. But at least in the States, it seems like there are fewer and fewer opportunities, and companies large and small are really feeling it financially. What type of role do you believe that opera plays in 10, 15, 20 years from now?
I think it's a great question again. I think that, I'm always a little saddened when I hear people say opera is dying or opera is, you know, that always makes me very sad because I don't think it's dying. I think that it is struggling a little bit. And I think that a lot of that is due to failings in public education system, and the education system long before we expect them to become audience members or people who appreciate the art form. So, if we listen back, there's so many, first of all, there are so many more ways now to get entertainment. So when we look at when opera was in its prime, let's say its prime, right? We look back.
What does that mean in your mind, the prime of opera?
Oh, golden age of opera. I mean, if we look at the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, we look at kind of this. I mean, of course, this is an art form that is hundreds of years old, hundreds and hundreds. So we could say like the real heyday was when it was created. I don't know that it's really, but
the 1630s and 40s.
Yes, exactly. So, but if we look into in our generation or something that has a recorded legacy, right? Because also, when did recordings start? All of this. If we look back at those years. First of all, there were not as many ways to find entertainment, so people would kind of huddle around the radio with their families and listen to the Texaco broadcast and do all of this. And it was part of the education system. It was really something that that people grew up with and they knew, and it was a popular form of art at the time. So even if you look at the princess musicals or musicals that came out of that were like operetta, and then they came out through there. Those early musicals, Rodgers and Hammerstein and all of this, those singers were trained classically. They really were. There was a lot of golden age repertoire that came out of a classical background. So even the more contemporary art form like musical theater had classical influences in it as well, right? Like John Raitt singing Soliloquy from Carousel. That is absolutely a classical production in the way he sings. We've gotten further and further and further away from that to the point where the art form to some people seems to be antiquated. There are also, I think, which was a pity, is that back in the day it was associated with a certain socioeconomic class. So you would see people going to opera in their furs and the hats and the thing, and it was kind of, so there's that stigma attached to it. But I would say that opera is now more than ever, and I see that living in this industry, paying attention to what people are wanting, right? The audiences. So, and there is a call right now in these last number of years for living composers, works in our own language, contemporary pieces. And like the Metropolitan Opera just recently, I think this past year, announced that they would be having new works every year. They would be opening their seasons with a 20th or 21st century piece so they are paying attention. The houses are paying attention to this. I think that more experimental work is really important. That being said, I think that it's important that we keep music palatable for people as well, right? Like if you are introducing audiences to a contemporary work, it is important that it's a music that they can digest. I think that is, and sometimes with contemporary composers classically, it becomes extremely angular. It's something that is hard for people to digest and to take in. So I think there are a number of factors that have to be considered about how we bring opera forward. I just saw something yesterday which really shook me. It was so wonderful. Was that there's a company up here called Buffalo Opera Unlimited, and it is a company based right out of Buffalo. It's been going on for a number of years, and they have a new artistic director, Matt Marco, who's wonderful, and he's changing some things about the company very quickly. But they did a production these last few days of Jake Heggie's 3 Decembers, which is this really amazing work about this. It focuses on 3 characters, a mother and her 2 children, grown-up adult children, and it's set during the AIDS crisis, and without giving too much away, this father that abandoned the family, and it's an extraordinarily topical and human story. And it was a small scale production in Buffalo at Shays, the Shays Theater there, and it was a nice crowd, and it was very, very intimate. The woman who was Jessica Ann Best was the woman who sang the leading role. She also stage directed it. So it was and it was remarkable. It was absolutely remarkable because it is operatic, but it was absolutely a piece of theater. It was really a piece of theater, and the audience went crazy, and there were people who had gone to both performances, and I think that anybody, any general, but like that is something that I would take anybody to. anybody and say, this is something that you will probably love, because we all know that story, right? Whether it's firsthand or through media, or if we all know our generations all lived through the AIDS crisis, and everybody is, has family issues, and it's something, and the music is beautiful. It's extremely beautiful. Heggie's an amazing composer. And so I looked at that yesterday and I thought, this is really something, this is really actually a wonderful thing. It wasn't proving that opera was trying to go this new direction. It was just beautiful storytelling. It was incredible singing and beautiful storytelling, and very moving. I think going forward, we need to do that. I think we need to have contemporary works. We need to have things that people can understand and find accessible. At the same time, and that's what we're doing here at Fredonia now, we're making sure that the students are exposed to a range of repertoire and styles of production. We're doing Mozart's Così fan tutte this fall, and we're doing a stylized period production with Rococo costumes, and because these singers have to also know that there are still classical productions happening, and they have to know how to move in a production period, how to wear period costumes, how to do, and then every spring we will do a contemporary work, usually with the Western New York Chamber Orchestra that we've just started a collaboration with, and we'll be doing a world premiere of an opera by Glenn Cortese this next spring. So, and just this past, that's how we met actually, right? With this having guests for dinner through Hannah, so, and through Core Productions. So we're committed to creating this range of experience and opportunity so that we know how to move forward. I'm so happy to see in our art form that there is far more diversity right now, that there is so much more inclusion, that there is more gender fluidity, that there is more, everything that is happening in the world needs to be reflected in opera, right? We have to find ways to make any art form, whether it's opera, musical theater, contemporary music, everything. It has to be something that people can connect to, that's reflective of the journey, so to speak, right?
Yeah. I'm glad you went that direction. When you said the word experimental, that can mean so many different things to so many different people, right? So you brought up another point in there that I think is really interesting. Aside from the date that it was written and what the composer says, what's the difference between opera and music theater?
So musical theater, if we talk about musical theater as an art form, it's a decidedly American art form, right? So, and you see in other countries, Wicked, right, translated into Dutch and Japanese, right? But musical theater as an art form is American. It is in English, right? It is stylistically of a certain totally different style than opera, of course, right? If you look at it structurally also, in terms of composition, opera and musical theater are very different. If you look at it in terms of the vocalism required, it's very different from one to the other, right? Even if we talk about things like amplified versus not amplified. Now, when we look at the older musicals, Golden Age, they were not using amplification in the way we're using it now, right? This is something, so there's a whole progression of classical opera going to operetta, right? Looking at like Strauss and these composers, and then going to or Kallman or these kind of people, and then going to the Golden Age musicals, Rodgers and Hammerstein, and going through all Rodgers and Hart and all of these people, and then contemporary, right, moving forward. So, but in terms of the differences, it's a huge stylistic. It's really a different genre, right? It's different genre. If we split hairs and you want to say, well, opera is music theater, it is theater and there is music, right? But say it is, but it's not musical theater. That really is a genre, saying, right, like that is from X period to X period. This is language, this is the style, this is also chord structure wise. Like when we look at, unless you're looking at something like Sondheim, which is extraordinarily complex musically, actually, you do hear, like, thematically, more similarity in a way in terms of what is happening musical theater than opera. Although you could say, for example, that Donizetti, Rossini, Bellini, composers of the bel canto, there was also a lot of thematic stuff happening musically there, But yeah, it's just, for me, a completely different genre, right?
I think it's an interesting boundary to play with sometimes, because you
Yeah.
just brought up the bel canto period, where there was a lot of the musical theater things that we think of today that were existed in that point, and then you look at a work like Hamilton that is a musical, of course.
Right.
But that's such an interesting piece musically, and the chord
Totally.
structure is interesting, and the way it all blends together.
Totally.
I was just curious on your take. I think it's a really cool question.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, the biggest thing, not only stylistically is there a difference, but the biggest factor is opera singing is produced without amplification, and musical theater is in general. So that's a very big fundamental difference, right? And also, I mean, the vocal production itself is a hugely different thing because of that, right? Because of that. So there's certainly musically stylistic difference, but I mean, and we could say, like, well, in opera, there's recitative, right? Which is like spoken bits of dialogue, but that's the same in like Hamilton, right? I mean, there's also spoken, exactly. It's like, so if somebody's rapping something, that's very similar to recitative in a way, right? Because it's kind of tonal, it's spoken on pitch, but it is spoken. It's kind of what it is. So yeah, there's structurally similarities, but it's genre-wise very different, I would say, and I would say that in terms of musical theater performers, it's not that opera singing is not extraordinarily difficult, because it's extraordinarily difficult, but there is even, I would say, I want to say a greater burden or responsibility. I think so on musical theater performers, because they have to shape their voices to fit so many different styles within musical theater. Mm-hmm. So in this day and age, especially, a young woman has to go into an audition and be able to belt her face off, but also sing golden age repertoire in a soprano that sounds quasi-classical.
Right.
Whereas opera singers are not being challenged to do the belt component or mix or any of that kind of stuff.
So 5 aria package and
exactly right. That's exactly right. Whereas like a musical theater performer has like 20 different 16 or 32 bar cuts that they have to kind of, right. It's a very different thing. And, musical theater performers generally do 8 shows a week. They have an incredibly grueling schedule, which opera singers do not. That's a totally other thing. Yeah. Yeah.
So you're now at Fredonia. You're just going into your first summer at Fredonia. What was it about that institution that attracted you?
So I had been, like I said, I'd been in Europe for about 6 years before I came back to the States, and I had a very fine experience over there. But I felt like it was time to come back. I have a lot of respect for the history of classical vocal music in Europe. It's a European art form, but it's just when we say like musical theater is decidedly an American art form, the founding of it, the starting of it, right? Opera and classical vocalism is decidedly European and where it was started. So I really wanted to get over there, and I had been over there as a student after Curtis for 3 years, but I really wanted to go back and work in it, which is different than being a student in the European culture. And so I went back, and it was a very good experience. But what I felt at the end of my time there was that American singers, and I do believe that, I think that American singers are the most comprehensively trained. I do think they are the best trained singers in the world. That does not mean that they're always the best artists. It means they're the best trained singers. When we talk about artistry, that's a very different matter. But in terms of the training, in terms of languages, in terms of vocal technique, dramatic training, all of these things, classical singers, I would say the States would be the place to get the best training. And I wanted to come back to that. I really wanted to come back to that and be part of that process. And Fredonia, so I had actually been presented with an opportunity about 3 or 4 years ago to come here for a job, but it was just a 1-year lecturer position. And at the same time, I had been offered, and it was during the pandemic, and I had been offered a full-time job in Greece. And I thought, well, it's probably safer to take the full-time job in Greece rather than a 1-year job, which may or may not turn into something at Fredonia. But even then, I was captivated by the school. I was sad to have turned that down because I wanted to come here. I really wanted to. And I just had known of the reputation of the school for a long time. It has a wonderful reputation as an institution, and they have a very big success rate with their singers. It's very much a music ed program as well, and they have 100% job placement with their music ed students when they get out of here, which is amazing. Yeah.
Is that what you mean when you say success rate?
In terms of the music education component, yes, it's huge. But also, what's amazing to me is that there are a number of singers who've come out of this program, like Michael Hawke and Amanda Lynn Bottoms, and people who've graduated from this program who were music ed majors to start, and they went on to Kyle van Schoonhoven was a music ed person to start here, and he just won the Metropolitan Opera competition 5 years ago. I mean, he was a music ed major, became a performer while he was here, and took off. And Michael Hawke is, he's now a resident artist at Seattle Opera, and he was at LA and Santa Fe. And Amanda Lynn Bottoms, who's an amazing singer, is, she was in Santa Fe the last couple summers, and she's doing world premieres now of pieces. And so these are like incredible singers that have come out of an institution that is largely, I would say, or known more as a music education institution, but they also have an incredibly important performance component through the Hillman Opera, through the opera arm of this institution. And I knew about it. I knew about the reputation of the school when I interviewed here. I think what sealed the deal for me was that it's a wonderful faculty. There is tremendous goodwill. There's a great sense of collaboration. It's a large voice faculty. There's like 12 voice teachers right now here. And to find a voice faculty of any size where there isn't some kind of tension or infighting, or people are kind of, it's a dramatic art form by nature, but to be part of an institution where it really feels like a supportive, really collegial environment, which it is here, is very special. So that was an important thing, but also the students. When I interviewed here and I did some teaching on my interview day, the students were just hungry for information, and they are kind, and they are responsible, and they do their work, and they are very talented. And I think Fredonia we're going to try to change that, but I think it's a little bit of a secret in a way. It's like the best kept secret because it is a state institution, but the teachers, the faculty that I see here, and the level of goodwill and the level of accomplishment that the students come out with, it feels about as close to a conservatory as you can get in terms of the quality of the education. And it's a university, which I think is important. As a student, you are exposed to other areas, right? You are kind of becoming a really well-rounded person at the same time. So I've been here just about a year, and it feels like a wonderful decision to be here. It's really a great thing. I feel lucky to be here.
That's great.
Yeah.
And of course, it's too late for someone to audition to start in 2020, in the fall of 2024. But what type of students are you looking for future auditions? Like when someone comes in to audition for you, how could they make themselves stand out?
Well, it depends. A huge part of it is what their interest is, right? Like, are they wanting to go into music ed? We have a wonderful music therapy program. Are they wanting to be performance, or what are they looking to do? And the audition requirements are slightly different based on what you're wanting to do, right? Because if you're a music ed major, that's a slightly different track than performance. But what I also love here is that even though the majors are different, all of the majors have equal opportunity to perform. So when you come into audition for Hillman Opera, you could be cast as the lead in the opera if you're a fantastic singer, and you could be a music therapy major. It's not really, there's not like priority given to performers first. It really is who are the strongest, who are let's say the most equipped to be part of the opera at that time. Ideally, we want to give as much opportunity as we can to students throughout their educational experience here. But you're always looking at, okay, who's the most ready right now to take on this kind of responsibility? And I think what we're looking for is a natural gift for music, a talent and feel for music, a fine voice, a really fine voice. Especially with young singers, 16, 17, 18, there's so much development that has to happen, but we can certainly get a sense of, do you have a sense of phrasing? Do you have a sense of language about how to use text? We ask questions in the interview process, we'll say, well, what interests you about this major? What interests you about Fredonia? Tell us a bit about yourself, because we are wanting to, we're building a community here, right? And so it's important that we get to know the students as well, and to make sure that we can meet them where they are and help them fulfill their aspirations, right? To really get them to where they want to go. So it's a really multi kind of tiered approach to it, and we are building now the master's program very quickly. So when I came into the job, I asked, what were they wanting from someone in this position, and there were certainly goals and aspirations for the opera program, but also we'd like to develop the master's program as well, and so. We are doing that fairly quickly. So the curriculum is building. There's an expanded curriculum already in a year, and we have international students coming, and that's been very helpful to have been abroad for a number of years. So we have a wonderful tenor coming from Malaysia. He'll be here soon, and a Greek mezzo-soprano that I've worked with the last year who just won a Fulbright scholarship to come to Fredonia. It's the first time that Fulbright has supported a master's student to come for voice here at the school, and so we have it's really growing very quickly, and so we look for, like I said, it's a natural, in a way, a ability, a feeling for music, but understanding that it's then important for us to get them there, right? It's certainly not maybe even the most obvious talent at first, but it is passion, focus, commitment, and a certain natural, let's say, feeling for it is important.
Yeah. That's really phenomenal. So SUNY Fredonia really has its doors open to folks who have a strong talent and want to develop that, but not necessarily at the highest possible level when they start.
No, not at all. No. And what's fascinating is, Ted, I mean, sometimes, because so much of it is about mindset and personality and the ability to work, and we talked earlier about like it being a slow process and honing your craft and doing all of that. And I've seen, I've been in academia now for a number of years, and I've been in the profession for over 20 years. And sometimes, those star talents, they kind of start right out of the gate, running out of the gate, and you're like, oh, amazing. And then they may not have the temperament or the psychology or the emotional stability to actually go the distance. Mm-hmm. And then you can find somebody where you think, well, that's a nice voice. Let's see, let's see what it is. And they have a way of phrasing or something. And you work with them a little bit, and you see that they have incredible kinesthetic awareness, and they're able to repeat sensations easily, and they're able to, right? I mean, so much of learning how to sing is to, within a micromillimeter, move things around and kind of do things to repeat, consistently make a sound or production.
Things and they can't see or feel. Or
that's
touch,
right. That's right. And so then to see them kind of have that ability is fascinating. It's really, and then you see them, they're the ones that kind of like the dark horse in the running. They actually, all of a sudden, you're like, wow. And they're the ones who go on to do these great things, So, no, we're not about that at all. I think we're really about, and that's why we do ask questions in the interview process, and we try to get a sense of them as people, because it is a journey that we are part of, and it kind of takes a village to get somebody to where they want to go, whether it's music ed or music therapy or performance, or it takes a whole group of people. So
yeah, what you mentioned a moment ago about the singers who come out of the gate really hot and then they sort of peter out. I learned that is also something that is very, very frequent in contact professional sports, professional fighting, as well as in the military and special operations. The people who actually make it at the highest levels and stay there for a prolonged period of time generally don't start out that good, because they have to have the kind of character to deal with the rejection, essentially.
Right. Isn't that fascinating? I did not realize that.
Apparently, it's extremely common in American football as well. The people who play in the NFL for something like more than 7 years, almost all of them were not starting on their high school team. Or some, I'm getting the specifics wrong. It's a sort of a running joke that we don't cite our sources on this podcast, but it's something along those lines.
Well, it was fascinating to me. A few weeks ago, I saw, what was it? It was the young woman in the sea. It was about the woman who was the first woman to swim the English Channel, right? And she was like, I was watching this movie and I was like, well, that's just such what it is and everything. I mean, they didn't even know she was going to live. As a child, she had measles and they thought she was going to die. And she was like weak from that. And she had like ear problems and all of this. But she was like, I'm going to swim. I'm going to swim. I'm going to swim. And had the brain and the ability to synthesize so many different parts of what it takes to do that. And she did it. And not only did she do it, she beat the record time that a man had set by like 2 hours.
Like a lot.
Yeah, I mean, by a lot. And I was just like, so it is kind of exactly that, right? It's always that the spirit, the mind, the ability to process and work and be focused. And it actually is almost more important than the natural talent, right? Because, and especially as a natural talent, if you come out of the gate and you're this naturally coordinated person, if you don't figure out what you're doing in a way, or you don't make that effort, and then it unravels at a certain point, it never comes back together, right? Because at some point you have to figure out what you're doing, right? Regardless of whatever it is. And it's the same with any elite kind of art form or anything, surgeon, anything. It's an incredibly, and then there is, of course, the unspoken kind of X factor gift, that extra thing that certain people just do have, I mean, they have, and that's the unknown quantity, let's say. So
right. I think that's so incredible. And now we're a little bit on a tangent. I'm sure we could spend another whole episode on this.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think with that, it's a wonderful place to wrap up. Don, thank you so much for your time and your insight, and your ability to just roll with the punches and answer whatever silly questions I might have come up with in the moment. I always want to leave my guests with the final word. Is there any last bit of wisdom or knowledge or advice that you would give to someone who may have just listened to our conversation?
No, I think just what I would say is that whether it's in opera or whether it's in dance or music or there's anything in the arts or frankly anything, any industry that somebody's really has an interest and passion for, is that there are many ways to kind of subcategories. There are many ways to find a fulfilling, successful life in any different area. And so I think exploration, again, whether it's in music, in art, and dance, and in any industry, exploration and finding what makes you happiest and what makes you feel like your most authentic self for the time that we're all here, is extremely important and valuable. And just to not be afraid to explore and experiment and to kind of push boundaries a bit to find out how you can achieve what you're wanting to achieve. Right.
I love it. I think that's a great place to end. Don, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ted, for your brilliant questions. I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed listening to that episode of the High Note Podcast just as much as we enjoyed recording it. If you'd like to learn more about our guest, you can check the description down below to follow them and all the places where you might be able to follow them. If you want to take the next possible step in becoming a high note athlete, again, everything you need is in the description down below. Before you leave, do make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe. It is the best way that you can help the podcast grow to reach more high-performance people just like yourself. I can't wait to see you next week.